What is up, guys? It's your buddy Blue Spooky here. I wanted to ask you guys a question before we start. Since pretty much all the videos are an hour and 30 minutes lately, do you want me to keep the Megamix name, or would you prefer I go back to doing so-and-so amount of stories, volume whatever? Let me know what you guys think, because I'm rather conflicted on it myself. Besides that though, if you guys end up enjoying this video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Doing any of those really helps the channel and the video to do well, and ensures I can keep making these for a long time to come. I do my best to make sure that every story in these videos has not been read by me before. However, because I've read so many stories, some may slip through the cracks sometimes. So please understand if that happens. It's hard to keep track of every single one when I've read like 10,000 of them over the 10 years I've been doing this. If you guys would like to support the channel further than you already do, please be sure to click the join button. It should be somewhere around the subscribe button. You can support the channel for an additional $2 at the lowest tier, and you get special emoticons next to your name when you comment, and that you can use when you comment as well. No content is locked behind the paywall, of course. It's just something additional you can do if you'd like to support the channel further than you already do. Just watching is a big help already. Anyway, without further ado, I will get right into the stories, and I hope you guys enjoy them. Have a great day. From an early age, I loved hearing scary stories. When I was first learning to read, I worked very hard in school. My teachers all thought I was trying to be a good student, but the truth is I just wanted to be able to read even more scary stories on my own. My mom recognized this passion of mine and would often share her own creepy tales if a storm took the power out. She would light a few candles and tell me about the frightening, weird, and sometimes baffling experiences she had growing up. Many of the stories were about her old home, which she suspected was haunted. As much as I loved these tales, though, sometimes the ones that were completely free of any paranormal elements scared me the most. My mom had grown up in quite a dangerous neighborhood. Many of her stories were simply about the truly frightening people she'd encountered during her childhood. A story about a ghost is scary to a child. A story about a living person who wants to harm you for absolutely no reason is scary to anyone. It communicated a truth about the world that I could never completely forget once I had learned it. The world can be a dangerous place, and the people in it aren't always good. A normal evening can become a descent into fear at any moment. And sometimes the only thing standing between you and true horror is a locked kitchen door. This story in particular has always managed to rob me of my sleep. My mom was home with her sisters one night. There were 6 of them in total, along with a brother who was out of the house at the time. My grandmother wouldn't be home from work for several hours, and my grandfather had already passed away at this point. Although some of the older sisters were teenagers, they were all young enough to feel vulnerable and alone that evening. There had been a fire in the house a few weeks earlier, and it damaged a large portion of one of the walls, making it very easy for an intruder to get in. Because they lived in a bad neighborhood, my mom and my aunt spent the evening together in the kitchen, with the door to the adjoining hallway locked. They didn't have much that anyone might want to steal, but they also knew that people break into homes for far other and far worse reasons. Besides the door to the hallway, there was no way to get out of the kitchen. The room was essentially landlocked. In other words, they were trapped in there. Unfortunately, because of the fire damage, the kitchen was the safest room in the home at that time, though. It wasn't exactly an ideal spot, but it was the best place to gather until someone older arrived home. My mom and her sisters were chatting and waiting for my grandmother to get back from work when they noticed something quite strange. The handle on the hallway door was turning as though someone were trying to get into the kitchen. They called out to ask if someone was there, but they got no response. The person just kept twisting the doorknob. This went on for several minutes. In a vain attempt to scare the intruder away, my mom and her sisters pretended they were having a big party. They made a lot of noise, hoping they might trip the person in the hallway into thinking there was a much bigger and older group of people in the kitchen with them. At first, it seemed like the trick might have worked. The handle did eventually stop moving, and for a brief moment, everyone thought the danger had passed. Sadly, though, this was not the case. The sound of someone trying to open the door may have stopped, but it was soon replaced with another mysterious sound, one at first that no one could figure out what it was. They only knew it was coming from the hallway. It took a few moments for them to realize that whoever was behind the door was now switching the hallway light on and off. Somehow that was even scarier than someone still attempting to get in. There was no reason for this person to switch the lights on and off like that, but they kept doing it. Clearly, they were now just taunting my mom and her sisters. The fact they never said a single word just made it that much more terrifying. My aunt called the police, but the police were notoriously slow in that neighborhood. There was simply too much crime for them to respond to quickly. After calling the police, she also called a neighbor and asked them to come over to the house. Understandably, the neighbor was just as frightened by the thought of this intruder as they were. He went over to the front door and shouted for them to come out. It was a small house, but he didn't want to go inside himself. He thought maybe he could scare the intruder off by making it clear that an adult had now arrived and was waiting outside for everyone. He was wrong, though. All throughout this experience, the noises never stopped. My mom and aunts had finally had enough, though. They needed to escape that room somehow. Every sister grabbed a knife, and they all lined up at the hallway door, from oldest to youngest. It was one of the few times my mom was happy to be the youngest of 7 children. After a moment, they opened the door to the hallway and charged into it, knives at the ready. They hoped this might scare the intruder away, but their main goal was simply to get out of the house. When they entered the hallway, the light was off already. The sun had fallen by that point, so the entire hallway was completely dark. That was probably for the best, though. No one truly wanted to see the person who had been taunting them all evening. More importantly, they didn't want that person to get a good look at them. My Aunt Nora, the oldest of the sisters, did see something, the outline of a dark figure, running down the hall and up the stairs. She didn't take any time to stop and confront the figure, though. Instead, she pushed all the others to run out of the house. They spent the rest of that evening out front, waiting for the police and my grandmother. Eventually, the police did arrive. They searched the home, but whoever broke in was gone already, obviously. Everyone agreed that the person must have entered and exited the home through the fire-damaged section. They never caught the intruder. It could have been a random lunatic, or it could have been someone they saw every day. Maybe the person was just passing through the area, or maybe they had been stalking my mom and her sisters, watching them for weeks. Not knowing who had broken in that night was frightening, and yet not knowing why this person decided to spend an entire evening tormenting 6 young girls with something as simple as a noise was even worse. People never believe me when I tell this story. My closest friends don't even believe me. My parents didn't believe it when they were alive, and even my own wife and kids doubt me. Back when I used to live in Nova Scotia, I worked for a man that would buy houses and flip them after renovating them a bit. He would try to do a thorough inspection, both before and after renovations took place. Of course, there were always a couple of houses that he missed, and I was the one who was sent to inspect those. I don't remember the exact date, but it was in late July of 2000. The rain was pouring heavily outside, and thunder was shaking the area. The roof had recently been retiled. and I was inspecting to see if there were any leaks at all and if all the windows were watertight. I was alone in the house, and I was sitting in a small office space, which also served as a safe room. It was connected to the master bedroom. The only way in and out of this safe room was through that bedroom. I was writing on my report and getting ready to leave when all of a sudden I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. I glanced up at the security feed on the TV in front of me. The security cameras had been set up the day before, and even though they were on, nothing had been set to record yet. I noticed a dark figure coming up the stairs from the kitchen towards the bedroom area. I knew that now that renovations were done, only 3 people had the key to this house. The other 2 weren't anywhere near this place. Feeling slightly concerned, I pushed the button to the safe room door. I watched the monitors as this dark figure paused as though they heard the rumble of the door shutting, then continued up to the landing. There were only 2 cameras on the second floor, one at the top of the stairs and one pointing down the hallway. I watched as the dark figure seemed to just glide down the hallway, peeking in each room before entering the master bedroom. My blood turned to ice, and I turned around to look at the sealed door behind me. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then I distinctly heard the sound of a soft reverberating thumping coming from outside the safe room. I turned back around and fixed my eyes on the monitor once more, but there was no camera angle to help me see what was happening directly outside. For several minutes, I sat there, terrified, with my eyes frozen on the screen. I was waiting for the figure to re-emerge from the master bedroom, but it didn't do so. I broke into a cold sweat. I tried calling the police on my cell phone, but either because of the thick walls of the room or the storm outside, possibly both, I couldn't get any reception. After another few minutes of staring at the screen, I stood up and cautiously made my way towards the door. I pressed my ear right up against it and heard muttering from inside the bedroom. I couldn't hear much. One thing I distinctly did hear was part of a sentence. It sounded like they were calling out for a berry or something. Suddenly, another thump came on the door. I was terrified. Not only was this figure not leaving, but they seemed to know I was in there. They also seemed very intent on reaching me. It was the longest night of my life. I stayed fixed in the chair, staring at the monitor practically non-stop, barely blinking for 6 hours. Occasionally, I'd check my phone for reception, but no one ever left the master bedroom. I would occasionally check the other cameras in the house just in case I missed something, but I never saw any other movement. I finally broke down out of exhaustion and started to doze off. It was about 15 minutes before snapping wide awake again. Dawn had arrived, and now the light was beginning to fill the house outside the room. I couldn't see the figure, or any signs it had left either. Summoning all my courage, I stood up and took in a deep breath. I opened the door, half convinced I would be looking directly into the eyes of a madman. I nearly had a heart attack when daylight hit me right in the eyes, but there was no one in the room. Whoever had been there had vanished already. I quickly gathered up my things, shut the door behind me, and immediately my phone started buzzing, showing me I had several missed calls. As I was about to leave the area, I glanced back and noticed a small red smear on the outside of the safe room door. It was barely an inch long, but it was a noticeable enough mark for me to be certain it hadn't been there the night before. I ran down to my car and floored it out of there. I never went back, but I later sent 2 of my friends back to the house to see if there had been any signs of forced entry, which there hadn't been. My family is convinced I had some kind of fever dream, but I know what happened, and the experience still traumatizes me to this day. I still get nervous about being all alone in large houses. Someone suggested the figure may have been paranormal, like a spirit haunting the house or something. Maybe that's a possibility, but I can't get over the red smear on the door. In my mind's eye, I can't stop visualizing a madman with a bloody face pressed up against the door, leaving a nose print or something on its smooth surface. I don't really believe the paranormal theory. As the night went on, I got to hear more of what they were muttering, and I remember distinctly they were saying, "Bury you up to your neck." My one and only experience with a safe room happened in 2010. It was a very nice house right on the beach, on the west coast of Australia. It was my first year in college, and my entire political science class had been invited to a party to celebrate the resignation of the Prime Minister. I didn't know the host personally, but my teacher did, and despite the place being as big as a hotel, every room was packed with guests, drinking, mingling, and making boring conversation. I barely even knew anyone there except for my classmates, so most of us just kind of hung out drinking some champagne out by the pool. After a few of us had overindulged, though, we started daring each other to strip off some layers and jump into the water. After about 6 people were in the pool splashing around in their underwear and making a ton of noise, I figured any negative attention would be directed more at the people in the pool than anyone around it. My bestie and I helped each other out of our dresses, and we sat at the side of the pool with our legs in the water. There was one younger guy around our age who I didn't recognize. He was nice enough to keep refilling our drinks while we sat and kicked our legs in the water. He said his name was Hugo. My friend Tanya and I continued to make jokes about how we better not be spiking our drinks or something. He wasn't like a server or anything, he was just being nice. We knew what he was after, of course, and we figured he would keep coming back to enjoy the view of us in our lacy underwear, waiting for us to get just drunk enough. To his disappointment, I imagine, we both knew when to cut ourselves off, and eventually stood up and got dressed again, then went back inside. I mingled for another 40 minutes or so and eventually lost track of Tanya. After returning from the bathroom, I noticed Hugo waiting for me at the end of the hall. When I walked over to say hello, he produced a rose from behind his back. It was so sweet and cheesy that it actually made my heart skip a beat. We spent the next few minutes making out next to a grandfather clock in the hall. He paused for a moment and said there was a more private space we could go. I followed him into a back office that was unoccupied. At first, I was fine with it. I figured he would just close the door and we would get frisky on the desk. The sounds of the party weren't that far away, and there were plenty of windows to see into this room, so I didn't feel too unsafe about it. Instead, though, he led me to a sliding door hidden by a curtain, which opened into an even smaller office without any windows. It only had a single desk and chair. I walked in for a peek, and it suddenly occurred to me what I was standing in. I asked if this was a panic room, and he nodded. Without hesitating, he smacked a button on the wall, and the metal door slid shut with a loud thud. It was like an elevator door, but much heavier. He whispered in my ear, "No one can hear us in here." He began kissing my neck. I don't know if he meant to be reassuring or not, but it came across as very intimidating in the moment. I broke away and said, "No way, I'm not doing this in here. Open the door." His expression was confused for a split second. Then he started to get angry. "Come on, don't be like that." I pivoted away from him, but he moved to intercept me and blocked my way out. "Please, I get claustrophobic, so open the door." He kissed me and whispered again, "Don't worry about it, it'll be fine." He put his hands on my waist and tried to guide me further in, but I resisted. "Not until you open that door." That's when he put his hand on my stomach and physically pushed me into the room. I distinctly remember thinking, okay, well, I tried to be nice. I had been harassed and stalked by a neighbor several years beforehand, so I made it a habit to always have something on me to defend myself with. I lowered my hands and popped a tiny false pearl off my ring, exposing a little spike beneath it. I insisted one more time in a stern voice that I was not kidding and to open the door right now. He lowered himself and placed both hands on the inside of my thighs. When he leaned in, I cut the side of his face with my little spike and punched him as hard as I could with the other hand. I didn't quite hit his eye, but I came pretty close. He immediately leapt back and started cursing and yelling like a cat does when you step on its tail. I jumped up and maneuvered around him. I hit the button and got the hell out of there. I shoved myself not very gently through the crowd until I found my teacher and a handful of other students in the front hall. A few of them were already leaving in their own cars. I immediately asked if I could catch a ride. I didn't tell anybody about what happened until later that night when Tanya returned to the dorm. In retrospect, that was kind of a risky thing to do because he could have potentially trapped someone else in there with him. But I figured I'd given him enough of a sting that he probably would not be in any condition to get up for the rest of the night. I never saw him again after. I'm not entirely sure if his plan was to rear me in there or what. But if not, I'm not sure why he was so adamant on refusing to open the door. If I was a little bit drunker, maybe it would have worked on me. People may accuse me of being a tease and leading him on or whatever, but the fact is, I didn't want to be in a locked room all by myself with a guy who was much bigger than me and refused to open the door. Some backstory. This happened when my grandparents were in their early to mid-20s. My grandma worked at a daycare and school for a while, but she quit when she had kids of her own. She would have kind of an unofficial daycare/babysitting job at their house, taking care of some of the neighbors' children whose parents worked during the day. Some new neighbors had just moved in down the street, a husband and wife, and they had 2 kids of their own. This was the 1960s in suburbia. Very different times back then. They invited my grandparents over for dinner one night. The wife was showing my grandma around the house a bit, and as it turned out, they ran a daycare center from their house as well. She showed my grandmother the room they used. My grandma was having some trouble connecting with this woman, so of course she mentioned she also ran a daycare at home. The woman immediately got angry, asking her if it was official and licensed and whatnot. Well, it wasn't. She explained to the woman that it wasn't really an official daycare, just her babysitting for some neighbor's kids at her home. They were just kind of calling it one. This seemed to calm the woman down, and they were able to have a normal dinner. The husband and wife kept recommending after to my grandparents, though, that they send over the neighbors' kids, as well as my mom and uncle, to their house instead, as they were an accredited daycare center. My grandma wouldn't have to take care of them then. Well, the rest of the dinner went fine, and my grandparents left a little bit weirded out by their insistence, but whatever. A few years later, my grandma was reading the paper and saw the husband had been arrested for molesting children, his own, as well as the ones that had been supposedly safe in their accredited daycare home. To this day, my grandma thinks the reason the woman was so defensive is because she knew something was going on with her husband. Thankfully, my grandma decided to keep looking after the children, so they never had to deal with that awful man. This was back in 2018, when I lived in the suburbs of Paris. I've been playing Pokemon Go since release, and I used to go out at night to play as well, always with my best friend on a voice call. It was a night just like any other, following my usual route. It was around 2 a.m. or so, and I had already covered a good 2 kilometers. I found myself about 1 kilometer away from home, standing near a Pokestop, and catching what I could while talking to my friend, just like every other night. It was a residential street with a few streetlights, but quite dark as there was only a field behind it. After about 5 minutes, though, I noticed a man in his 30s on the opposite sidewalk, just a few meters away. He was holding some hedge shears in his hand, and there was a pile of branches at his feet as well. I thought the man must have been trimming the branches of his tree or something. However, when I described the scene to my friend, he said immediately, "You should leave right now. No one does gardening in the middle of the night like that." Despite my friend's warning, I was so focused on Pokemon Go and wanting to capture all the Pokemon before leaving, I stayed while keeping an eye on the man's actions. I wanted to, at least. As I looked at the man, I realized he was not cutting any branches. He was only staring at me. He would occasionally move and hide as well, behind a parked van nearby, trying to spy on me through the windows. He must have known very well that I could still see him. I began to feel scared at this point. Despite my friends pleading for me to leave, I was frozen in place and hesitated to move. I was enraptured by this man's strange behavior. He began crossing over to my side of the street and hiding behind some bushes while staring at me. Then he went back to his pile of branches, pretending to clip them while staring at me again. At that point, I had enough. I finally decided to leave. I walked toward my home, trying not to show any fear. I had a straight path back there. My friend on the call, though, told me to keep checking behind me, just in case the man was following me. Indeed, he was still holding his hedge shears, only about 10 meters behind me now. I then made a left turn instead of going straight, even though it made the way home longer. I wanted to make sure he was following me, and this wasn't just a coincidence. He continued to do so. I picked up my pace, taking snaps of the man just in case something happened. When I reached the end of the street, I was out of breath but safe. There was no one behind me anymore. I entered my home feeling relieved, when suddenly, a white car pulled up right in front of my house. It stopped and the driver's window rolled down, revealing the man with his hedge shears. Now he knew where I lived. I rushed inside, locked everything, and grabbed a kitchen knife, and waited until someone woke up so I could go to bed. There were no further incidents after, and nobody believed me either. We checked surveillance cameras to prove that it happened, and unfortunately I was proved right in the end. When I was 18, so in about 2006 I believe, my friend and I decided to take a cruise to celebrate becoming adults. The type of cruise we chose to take had a lot of alcohol, food, and a lot of guys as well. One night I couldn't sleep. My friend was passed out cold, but for the life of me I just couldn't seem to drift off. I decided to go out to the deck and have a cigarette and take a little walk, hopefully tire myself out a bit. I found my headphones, cigarettes, and a lighter, and left the room quickly. The halls were deserted, which didn't really surprise me, as it was about 3 a.m. or so. I put on my headphones and blasted my favorite band at the time, Mariana's Trench. I walked out of the hall to the upper deck, when suddenly I felt an eerie feeling. I looked back, feeling like someone was watching me. The hair on my neck was standing on end. As I turned around, though, no one was behind me. I kind of laughed at my own paranoia. I said to myself, "Okay, Mandy, get it together." I walked up to the deck only to find it was also deserted. Not a big surprise. I found a spot on a bench closer in the front of the ship and sat down to light a cigarette. I stared out at the ocean as I smoked my little snitzer stick for a few minutes. I was focusing on the reflection of the moon on the water when suddenly I felt someone sit down beside me. I looked over instinctively, only to find a guy about 40 or so had plopped down right next to me. I didn't exactly feel like talking to a stranger, so I simply looked back at the water. The guy beside me suddenly yanked out my earbud though. I looked at him annoyed and said, "What the hell are you doing?" "You're so pretty," he told me. Thank you, I replied awkwardly. Are you here alone? He asked. He moved closer as he did so. I told him no, feeling quite anxious. You with your boyfriend then? He asked. I looked at him and my gut told me to lie in this moment. I said that he was sleeping, and he gave me a creepy sighing grin. Pretty girls like you. If you were my girlfriend, I'd be making these waves rock, he joked with a laugh. I looked at him horrified. My name's Mohammed, he told me, inching even closer. I didn't respond and instead put my earbuds back in, hoping he would get the hint. Then I continued to smoke my cigarette. A few seconds later, he yanked my earbud out again. This both scared me and pissed me off, and it kinda hurt a little. I stood up quickly. Do you like wine? He asked. I have wine in my room. You should join me for a glass. At this point, I was freaked out. No, I don't want to drink any wine and I don't know you, so leave me alone, I told him very sternly and angrily. He laughed at this. You need someone to clear up all that stress for you. I started to walk away and head back to my room. I had only gotten about 3 steps away when he grabbed my left wrist and stopped me before I could say anything. He grabbed me and held me in a huge hug. You smell so good, he said. I pulled away violently. I was able to get far enough away from him that I could run quickly inside. A security guard must have heard me scream, because as I reached for the door to get back in, he opened the door for me and let me inside. I was crying from fear. He asked me if I was okay, and I managed to choke out what just happened. He told me to stay inside as he rushed outside to deal with the guy. A few minutes later, he came back in and told me there was no man on the deck. Maybe he had gone back to his room. He advised me to fill a report and give a detailed description of my attack. He then escorted me back to my room. The next morning, I told my friend about what happened, and she made me agree not to go out on deck alone anymore. She didn't have to tell me twice. The rest of the cruise I was on edge, but I didn't see the man again. The weird thing is that there were no names listed on the ship matching his, and no man matching his description was ever found either. According to the security guard who took my initial report, a few coworkers even tried to find the man, as they didn't want him harassing any other woman. This scares me. How it happened, how distinct he smelled, and how greasy he seemed. It was all just so ominous. I was going to make a throwaway for this, but what the hell? I'll take the risk of looking like a totally insane person. No one is going to believe me anyway. This happened when I was 17. I'm 32 now. I graduated high school and got my first apartment in a nice town. I lived by myself, other than my cat Snowball. Don't laugh. I named her when I was 8 years old. A few details before we get started. I've never been a fan of cat boxes. Worst part of being a cat owner is shoveling tiny chunks with a tiny shovel every day. I got one of those motion-activated, self-scooping deals and left it on the back patio. I ran the cord inside to power it and left the back sliding door open just big enough for her to get in and out. It was about 5 to 6 inches. The patio was one of those 8x8 cement floor types, surrounded by a 5-foot-tall wooden fence. If you looked out from my bedroom door, you'd be facing right at that sliding door, with hanging blinds, living room in between. The kitchen was off to the right. So I'm playing video games at the computer in my room, with my back facing that door. It was about 1 a.m. I hear Snowball start to make one of those awful cat growling noises in the back of her throat. I was pretty locked into my game though, so I told her to knock it off, not even looking at her. She kept on doing it though. I told her to shut up. I was getting quite irritated because I was doing well in the round. She got loud enough though to break me from my gaming zone, and I realized that this behavior was not normal. I got up from my computer, only to see her standing in the doorway facing out, her back to me. She was in full-on Halloween cat mode, hair sticking straight out of her back. She was completely arched and looked tense like I'd never seen her. The way she was just going crazy. I looked out into the living room, where she was facing. Nothing seemed to be amiss. I couldn't see anything obviously there. I looked down at her to say something to the effect of, "What's the matter?" She made this insane sound, like a combination of a hiss and a growl, and spitting. She started to take a few steps backward. That's when what appeared to be a little person ran out of the kitchen on 2 legs, wearing a tattered piece of cloth or a bag over them. That was a real-life jump scare. The cat jumped backward about 3 feet in the air. I jumped too. I glanced down at her as she did this, but quickly looked back up. I heard her land with a crash behind me. I was fixated on this person moving though. It was like time was slowed down. I was watching these things happen, but everything was moving so fast. They ran out the back door and through the blinds with a crash, at speeds that almost didn't seem natural. The blinds were swinging heavily. My heart was pounding. I stood there dumbfounded. What the hell had just happened? I was just staring at the back patio door, at those swinging blinds. I was not moving my eyes at all. I started to notice that something was wrong though. The blinds were all softly swinging except the 2 closest to the opening. I saw they were making an inverted V. I followed that down, and between them I could see this person's head poking through the blinds and staring at me. At this point, a singular loud thought filled my mind. What the fuck is this? At the conclusion of that, every one of the hanging blinds suddenly shot upward and outward. I jumped again, and my heart tried to blast out of my chest almost. They were just swinging all over the place. I took a glance at where the person had been, and they were already gone. I beelined for the kitchen. The refrigerator door was open. I opened a drawer and grabbed the biggest knife I saw. I was shaking with adrenaline, like I'd never experienced before. I rushed to the sliding door and tried to slam it shut. It wouldn't close though. I opened it a bit and slammed it back, but it still wouldn't close. What the hell? I was completely being stupid though. It was the cat box cord blocking the door. I crouched down, brandishing this knife like a complete idiot, looking out the glass door and waiting for this person to just launch at my face or something. As I was shaking, I reached across myself with my left hand to the power plug on the wall to move it out of the way. I stared out, waiting to stab anyone that approached. I fumbled to get it unplugged. It felt like my hands couldn't do anything right. I unplugged it and opened the door real quick to throw the cord outside. I threw it like a spaz though, and it hit the wall at the side of the door and fell down still inside. Oh, fuck me, I guess. I picked it up and did it again. It landed outside this time. I heard a scratching sound, and my eyes darted up to see 2 tiny hands holding onto the fence. The person climbed down feet first, hanging on. It would have been slightly comical if it didn't look so terrifying. I heard them land in the bushes outside. I could hear fast footsteps as they ran off. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I swear this is completely true. I've heard everyone explain it away as me mistaking a raccoon or having a hallucination from being tired or whatever. It was not any of those things though. I don't blame you if you don't believe me though. It sounds ridiculous, and maybe you shouldn't believe me. Back in May of 2010, while in desperate need of cash, I agreed to house sit for one of my old high school teachers. He had contacted me via Facebook and asked me if I would be willing to water his plants, collect his mail, and clean up the place while he went out of town for a couple of days. He didn't specify where he was going to be going, but he agreed to pay me $400 for 2.5 days with half of the payment up front. I agreed. I never really liked him much in high school. He was teaching classic literature, and he always seemed to enjoy pointing out any illustrations that in any way featured nudity. His eyes always had this hungry look to them, for lack of a better term, and he tended to wheeze like he was out of breath all the time, even though he was kind of a small guy. When I arrived at his place, the key was beneath the mat, and $200 were in an envelope on the kitchen table. I turned on my music and walked around watering the plants. I cleaned and vacuumed the ground floor and made myself dinner as well. I found his house to be kind of boring, actually. It was filled with old books, stacks of newspapers, ancient-looking furniture that didn't really look comfortable to sit in. I settled into my sleeping bag on the guest bed, but I had a hard time staying asleep. It seemed like every 5 minutes there was a strange noise coming from the house, and that would put me on edge. The following morning, I went back to my own home. I had breakfast and took a shower before coming back to clean the second floor. Upon entering the guest bedroom, though, there was the faint smell of something in the air. It definitely had not been there before. What's more, I could have sworn my sleeping bag was in a different position than what I had left it that morning. I started to get a bad vibe. I decided that night I would sleep downstairs in the living room instead. I finished up the cleaning just after 10 p.m. I made some popcorn and enjoyed some cable TV, which I didn't have access to at my own place. At around 11, I shut off the TV, wrapped myself up in my sleeping bag, and tried to drift off. I was tossing and turning for a bit, and just as I began to doze off, there came a click of the doorknob turning in the other room. I glance over, and I swear by any guide you choose, I saw my teacher emerging from the pantry, wearing only his socks. He then slowly turned the corner and made his way upstairs. I grabbed my phone and my keys and exited out the back door as quietly as I could. I ran around front to get into my car and sped home, where I immediately called the police. I didn't know exactly how to explain this situation to them. I mean, he wasn't really breaking and entering, it was his own place in the house. But when I explained to the operator that he had deceived me into thinking he was gone, they sent out a patrol car anyway. I had to go back to collect the stuff that I had left at his house, so that comforted me greatly. When the police arrived, he answered the door, wearing my sleeping bag over his shoulders. The police searched the area and discovered a hidden cupboard, which was a secret room in the pantry. I hadn't been aware of this. That's where he'd been hiding with a digital camera. He had taken a few dozen photos of me all around the house, most of which were when I was sleeping. I showed the police the Facebook messages he had sent me, assuring me he would be out of town the whole time. They arrested him, and I collected all my remaining things, but left the sleeping bag behind. I didn't waste any time getting a restraining order against that man. He made bail, but actually died of a surprise heart attack a few weeks later. I guess he was rear-ended in his car at a stoplight, and it gave him a big enough shock for that to happen. I never got the rest of my money, but as morbid as it is to say, I'm glad I won't have to deal with him ever again. I work for a private security company, and my primary job is a safe room technician. Basically, I'm sent to test and do routine maintenance and repair or upgrade anything that needs service regarding a safe room or bank vault. I've only had to physically break into a safe room twice in my life. Normally, removing people from the safety of one is a police matter, and usually just involves drilling a hole through the wall. Usually, people trying to evade the police in this manner eventually come out when they get hungry enough. Or in case of emergency, the police will toss a smoker in through the hole they drilled. Once, I was called in after the police negotiation failed, and a man shot himself in the room. I had to use a plasma cutter to cut away the outer door. The man had fallen against the door, so when it slid open finally, he practically fell out right onto my feet. Dried blood was still caked over his face and clothes, but the second incident was far worse. A few years later, I was called in by local police to break open a safe room door in a basement. The house was on the market, and the real estate company had asked me to help get it open. They wanted to present it to potential buyers as a feature of the home. I told them that if it was locked like this, that meant someone was likely already inside. But they assured me that couldn't possibly be the case. No one had set foot on that property in months. I arrived at the home to inspect the room, taking into consideration that a power surge might have tripped something and sealed the door shut on its own. The agency didn't want me to damage the door if at all possible, but after running a few tests on the control panel, I told them it was sealed from the inside. Short of blowing it open and risking structural damage to the house, the only way in was me cutting through the door. They weren't very happy about that, but I was more concerned that someone had wished themselves in there or something, and I was about to have another corpse fall out right onto my shoes. After disarming everything and messing around with the control panel again, the door finally slid open, and the foul stench hit me immediately. On the carpeted floor, lying face down, was the withered corpse of a man. Both of his hands had been resting upon the inside of the door. The agency had gone through the local police to contact me, but they were not on the scene right now. I called them right away, and they informed me not to let anyone enter this room. An investigation team showed up and questioned me. It turns out the man's legs had been broken in 3 places, each most likely with a heavy instrument such as a sledgehammer. He had been left to sit and die in that room, being unable to get up under his own power and reach the button to open the door. I went back and disassembled the control panel and discovered the wiring behind it had been tampered with, potentially allowing someone to seal the door from the outside if they knew what they were doing. That night, I told my family about this discovery. My brother-in-law's first words were, "So you mean like the guy at the end of Saw?" At those words, a sick and chilling feeling swept over me. What a poor man, to have been brutally attacked and left to slowly starve in a sealed room where there was no escape and no one near enough to hear his calls for help. Not that anyone could have opened the door anyway. If the police ever arrested anyone for the murder, I was never informed about it. The real estate company kept the story quiet as to not dissuade anyone from viewing the house, not that it mattered. The place remained an open crime scene for quite some time after. I told the cops that the killer may have been somebody with a history in my field, but they didn't seem convinced. Whenever I'm idling, my thoughts often wander to that man and how long it must have taken him to die all alone in such severe pain, knowing there was no way to escape. I wonder what the reason was for such cruelty and who the last person he ever saw or thought about was. It really keeps things in perspective for me. And ever since that day, even on my worst days, I remind myself that at least I'm free and can look up and see the sun. Back in 2018, I ended up flying over to Greece for a week-long solo vacation. There were a few hotels I'd had my eye on while planning the trip, but then, for the same price, I found I could get an entire apartment on Airbnb. Some of the stuff they had available for rent was absolutely amazing too. For the price of an entire en-suite hotel room, I could get an apartment that looked like something a legitimate millionaire might choose to stay in during a visit to the French Riviera or something. Greece doesn't exactly have the strongest economy, so it kind of made sense it would be going for so cheap. Even so, though, compared to the other listings, there was certainly no other way to describe it other than suspiciously affordable. Like any other sane person might have done, I immediately went and checked all the reviews to make sure. Even with all the 5-star reviews and glowing praise of the apartment's owner, I still thought the whole thing was just way too good to be true. Then again though, there were only 2 windows where the place was not fully booked. So not only did that show that the other people were genuinely interested in the place, but it also meant it was a first come first served sort of deal, so to speak. I could book the place, check it out, then if it turned out to be some well-distinguished nightmare, I could maybe just find myself a hotel chain with a simpler but more reliable kind of room. The flight over to Greece was the first long flight I'd been on, and the whole process just completely exhausted me. It's weird that just sitting on a plane for 10 hours can do that to a person. I guess it was mainly the stress that took it out of me. Worrying that I'd lost my passport to e-ticket, constantly worrying I'd left something crucial back at home, all irrational first-time flyer stuff, I know. But after the relief of landing without a hitch, and making it to the Airbnb okay, I felt like I could sleep for days on end. Even the elation of seeing the apartment didn't keep me up for long either, and my God was I surely elated. It was everything I could possibly have imagined. A magnificent mosaic of black and white tiles and wrought iron spiral staircases. Why, they could have charged double the asking price and people still would have paid to stay in a place like that. The question remained though, why exactly did it have such a low rate? I know, it was a huge question, one that any right-minded person would have still been asking themselves. I guess the place's beauty and my exhaustion made for a perfect cocktail to wipe my brain of thought though. I told myself I could always properly survey the place the next morning, after a good night's sleep. I remember waking up just before dawn though, to the sound of something scraping really close right next to me. I mean, maybe scraping isn't the right word. I ended up leaning over to the bedside table, switching on the light and seeing what was definitely a cockroach running for the darkness below the bed. I hate bugs, and cockroaches have to be at the top of the list for me. Suddenly, I understood why the pricing was so low. The entire building had an infestation they just couldn't get rid of. Maybe they couldn't afford to have the place bug-bombed or whatever. They were hoping for a few quick bucks from the Airbnb so they could afford it. That little theory of mine made much more sense when the owners refused me any kind of refund, giving me some bulk about how Greece has lots of bugs in the summer. Apparently, other guests didn't have a problem with it, so these guys knew what they were doing, acting as though a roach infestation was like having a few houseflies. If it wasn't already clear, there was no way in hell I was about to spend another night in that place that had roaches crawling all over during the night. Luckily, I hadn't actually unpacked yet. I was able to just grab my stuff, jump in the rental, and drive down through town towards the harbor front, where I knew that there were a bunch of hotels awaiting me. As I was driving, though, I started to feel like there was something wrong with my left ear. It kind of felt cold on the inside. I started thinking maybe I had some kind of ear infection, that the exhaustion and stress of flying had messed with my immune system. As I was driving on my way to book a new hotel room and start an epic email battle to get a refund though, it wasn't like I was in much a position to do anything about it. Thing is, too, it was like 5 or 6 in the morning at that point, so it's not like any local clinics were open yet for me to get a once-over. When the weird feeling in my ear started getting even worse, I decided to pull over near the harbor front and stick a cotton swab in my ear to see if there was any blood or pus or anything. Apologies to those who find that a little gross, but if you did, stop reading now, because things are about to get way worse. I pulled over, fished around for a little Tupperware box of bathroom-related stuff, and pulled out a cotton swab. I gently pushed one end into my ear. Then, as I did, I felt something actually moving inside. At the time, I couldn't tell if it was because I'd pushed a clump of earwax or something further up my ear canal, but when I pulled the swab out again, I saw these 2 real thin, dark brown things stuck to the tip. I remember looking at them and thinking, what the hell are these? Suddenly, the thought hit me like a brick wall. I kind of wiggled my head again and felt the same weird movement in my ear. That's when I realized something that was like a worst nightmare come to life. There had been roaches near my bed when I woke up, and something was moving around in my ear. Those two little things on the cotton swab were roach legs. They were roaches inside my ear canal. I was in complete denial for a minute or two, trying to talk myself into it being anything else. When I actually accepted what was happening, I started to hyperventilate. It took me a while to calm down, but when I did, the next move was to grab a pair of tweezers I had with me. I carefully inserted them into my ear and tried to coax the roach out all on my own. I can barely describe the horrifying feeling, working the tweezers in and touching the roach, only feeling it scuttle further into my ear canal. It was like it was trying to burrow into my brain. I know that's not exactly how ears and brains work, and they're not remotely connected in such a close way, but in my groggy, terrified state, it felt like it was trying to bite through my eardrum. The more I tried, the more it crawled in further. I realized if I was actually going to get these things out of my ear, I'd have to go to the actual hospital. That's how I ended up driving over to Post-Racist University Hospital, and throughout the whole of that drive, I was acutely aware of the thing now trying to burrow its way further in. At this point, I feel I should make it clear that while it was not explicitly painful, it was the worst kind of mental torture I'd ever experienced. Walking into the ER was the first real piece of luck I got that day. Because it was so early on a Monday morning, there was next to no one else waiting to be seen. After a mother-daughter combo got themselves seen too, I was called up to the desk to tell them what my problem was. The first nurse I spoke to didn't even speak English, so I had to wait a few more minutes while she found someone that did. When I finally got the chance to explain the situation, she had this look on her face that told me she clearly didn't believe me. She asked me if I was in pain. I was about to say no, but then I felt so nauseated I was about to puke. She still seemed skeptical, but she took me to see the doctor anyway, who looked in my ear with an otoscope. Although I don't speak Greek, the muted reaction the doctor had told me there was definitely some insects in my ear. Using the nurse as a translator, the doctor told me the most important thing was for me to keep calm. I was told that getting it out would be relatively easy, but if I didn't keep calm, things were going to get pretty bad. Hearing that was hardly relaxing. The nurse advised me to control my breathing and focus on the fact everything was going to be okay. After that, another nurse took my blood pressure, which turned out to be alarmingly high. I had no idea why they were doing all these tests on me. I'm sure they had their reasons, but I was desperate for them to get to the actual extraction already. Thankfully, that's the next thing they did. The nurse explained all the stuff the doctor was saying, like how they were going to use lidocaine as a prep for getting the roach out. The lidocaine did its job alright and acted as a numbing agent, but before it did, the roach went into overdrive trying to escape the incoming fluid. That was the worst it ever felt for me. I'm glad it was over after that, but literally being able to feel the thing dying and scrambling about in my ear, just suddenly slowing down as it died. I'm not sure there are words in the English language to sum out the horrifying nature of it all. About 2 minutes after feeling it succumb, the doctor took these big curved tweezers and started removing the roach, but not in one go. He did it piece by piece. Once the whole thing was out of me, the nurse showed me what they'd removed on a napkin. I guess it would have been about an inch long when it was intact, which normally is not all that big, but with it in your ear canal, that's pretty damn huge. After that, my ear canal was given one final check over, just to make sure there was nothing left behind. They told me I was free to go, with a prescription for oral antibiotics and a type I would need to put directly into my ear for a while. The whole thing felt numb for the next 24 hours. As the week went on, it didn't really feel any better either. I guess it was just the aftermath of having my ear invaded by both a cockroach and a pair of surgical tweezers. The half-dead scratching sensation in my ear, though, just wouldn't stop. When I got back to Baltimore, I went over to my doctor to get checked up again. About a week after I got back from Greece, I went for my appointment and told her about the whole cockroach trauma. Just to be safe, she asked a physician's assistant to flush my ear out, in hopes that removing any wax buildup would help my hearing and get rid of the pressure. Once my ear had been flushed, they took a look inside. I can't even begin to explain how much my heart sank when I heard the physician assistant say she saw what she believed to be another spiky insect leg inside my ear canal. I felt sick. The whole ordeal was not even over. All I wanted was for it to finally end. The doctor ended up flushing my ear again, pulling out even more pieces of a roach that the doctors hadn't even seen. This was almost 2 whole weeks after the first incident took place. I cried quietly while the whole thing was going on. My doctor was amazing. She actually gave me a hug when the whole thing was done. She'd been my family doctor for years, so we had quite a close relationship like that. She comforted me and told me there might still be more inside. She was going to make me an emergency appointment the next day. When the appointment was over, I went home and tried my best to relax before heading to the ENT clinic the next morning. When I got there, they sat me in an examination chair. Then the ear, nose, and throat doctor placed some sort of microscope next to my head. He didn't say much at all. The whole examination took place in silence, right up until he said the dreaded words of, "Oh yeah, there's still something in there all right." The next thing I know, he's using what looked like a large pair of scissors with a blunt end to fish around in my ear canal for more bugs. That time, no kind of numbing agent was used, so it was actually quite painful. I could hear pieces of bugs crunching as he gripped them and pulled them out, even when he finished, and had flushed my ear out with water again, to the point he was 99% sure everything was eliminated. I still didn't feel that much better. That surprised me. I figured that once everything was out, I'd actually feel free of the whole thing, but I didn't. Instead, I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that so many bugs had existed in my ear for like 2 weeks, meaning there was a chance I was still going to develop a nasty ear infection. I've only really gotten over the whole thing over the past year or so, but even so, I'm deathly afraid of any crawling insect now that might sneak its way into my ear at night. I'm not nearly as bad as I used to be, but it's definitely still a thing for me, and I don't expect to be over it anytime soon. A few years back, I remember coming home late from work one evening. I was really tired and just went straight to the couch and watched some TV. It was very late though, and my eyelids got increasingly heavy. I turned off the TV and distinctly remember all the sleep mode lights on the various electronics that were hooked up to the TV. I also distinctly remember the way the street light was shining in through the blinds. I closed my eyes for what seemed like a few moments, and when I opened them, everything was exactly the same. I tried to move to get into a more comfortable position, but I realized I could not move at all. I instantly freaked out. My heart was pounding as I tried forcing every part of my body to move, but I couldn't do so. I tried to scream and yell for help, but nothing would come out of my mouth. I was terrified and felt helpless. It was a very strange and scary feeling. My mind was racing as I was trying to figure out why I was paralyzed. Was this something permanent? Did I need serious medical attention? As I was freaking out, I started to hear feet pattering in the hallway behind me. I was thinking maybe it was my younger sister. The pattern of the footsteps was consistent with that of a smaller child. I was beginning to feel relief that someone which I thought was probably my sister would come and help me. At that very moment, though, I realized my younger sister would have no business being up that late at night. She would have been too terrified to walk around in the basement anyway, not knowing if anyone was down there without any lights on. I realized these footsteps could not be my sister, and became even more terrified and confused by it all. I remember the fear was so overwhelming, I actually think it shocked my body for a moment. I feel like it helped me regain movement in my toes, and part of my back as well. The footsteps were pattering down the hall literally right behind my head, and back down the hall again. As I was panicking, I was able to use this partial movement of my back to scoot to the end of the couch. I fell off onto the floor, laying on my stomach with my face placed in the direction of those footsteps. I was still unable to move, and I began to hear those steps coming down the hall again. I was in a state of disbelief and complete terror as I heard each step getting closer and closer down the hallway. Finally, as the footsteps reached the end, around the corner of the wall, I saw what I can only describe as a little bizarrely shaped creature, maybe 2.5 to 3 feet tall. It was under a white sheet, so I couldn't see what it really looked like though. It was just casually walking down the hallway with a very strange and unsteady gait. The creature then stopped as it noticed me and turned directly towards me. It stared at me for a few moments. It almost reminded me of a smaller version of E.T. when it went trick-or-treating in the ghost costume for Halloween. It just looked awkward and not quite human, with a weird flat head. Not knowing what was under the sheet made it even more scary in its own right. The creature suddenly jerked its arms up and began waddling with intensity right towards my face. I was trying to scream and desperately escape, but I could only lay there motionless and helpless. I really thought I was going to die, or at least sustain serious permanent damage. It was pure horror and shock. Right as the creature tried to attack my face, I woke up with a start. The exact same spot I was in before. The sleep mode lights, street light beaming into the basement, it all looked the same. I was so confused and very disturbed. After doing a bit of research, I found out what I experienced was an episode of sleep paralysis. The dreams are easily mistaken for reality, almost like a full-on hallucination. It was so much different than any other dreams I'd ever had, and I will never forget that night. I hope to never experience anything like it again, and I hope you don't ever have to either. I was listening to some scary stories about drives down country roads, and I decided to share mine as well. One thing I've noticed in these stories, which has tended to be true of my own experiences driving down these roads, is that often they are very narrow, and sometimes you have to drive an extremely long way before you're able to find anywhere to turn around. Some rural roads I've been on have gone on for miles without coming to a driveway or any other turning point. I doubt that people who've not experienced driving on these roads would likely even believe that they exist. However, I've lived in areas where the dirt roads wind almost endlessly up into the hills. I had my own scary experience when I was just 13 years old. Yeah, I know what you're thinking right now. Why would a 13-year-old be driving a car in the first place? But where I grew up, that wasn't unusual. This was in the early 1970s. I'll tell you that my mom learned to drive when she was just 11. You weren't exactly going to come across police in waiting on these types of roads. So why did the driver's license even really matter, especially when there weren't going to be other people around on the road usually anyway? The police and everyone basically knew around here, but they weren't too likely to give you a ticket. Everyone was driving before they were old enough. When you turned off the main road onto the dirt road that led to my house, there was a really small convenience store there. My dad often sent me off to get some beer for him. Yeah, the store owner was also my aunt, and she knew I was getting it for my dad, so she always gave me the beer. I picked up the beer pretty quickly. I think my dad was probably pretty drunk as it was though. I thought I'd take the car and go driving a little while myself, so I drove out onto the main road for a while. Then I turned off onto a country road I'd never been on before. It was pretty fun for me to do this, find new places and explore areas I'd never been to. I thought the country road I lived on was small, but this one was barely large enough to fit the car on the road. The woods were really thick all around, and the further I went down this road, the more and more the road seemed to narrow. It seemed like the trees were almost converging onto the road, and more than once near the ending, a branch from a tree scraped against the window of my car as I drove along. This was extremely frustrating. I had to drive very slowly because of all the twists and turns in it. What the hell was I even supposed to do if another car came down the road? There was barely enough room to fit on the road, let alone room to turn. I had this horrible thought as well, that perhaps this road didn't lead anywhere at all. What would I do if it dead-ended? What if it used to lead to somewhere, but the forest had long since overgrown it? Worst of all, what if it led to somewhere that someone didn't want me to be? My dad had always told me that deep out in these hills, there were people you never wanted to meet up with. I didn't come across any other cars, but I did eventually come to a driveway. The problem, however, was that this driveway was gated off. I didn't see a house anywhere around either. I guess this could have just been a side road that led off to somewhere out on the hill, but it was either continue driving down the road I was already on, or find some way to use this driveway/side road to turn around. I nervously got out of the car. The gate was not locked, but it did have a bolt in it. I undid the bolt and opened the gate up. I kept looking around me, trying to see if anyone else was around. If they discovered what I was doing, who knows what would happen. I was getting into my car and turned around. I got my car out of the gate. I guess I should have just gone straight home, but I felt that I should at least go out and close it behind me. My car was now facing the opposite direction, so the only light I had to see by was my tail lights. I still felt obligated to shut it though. I got out and went over to close this gate. When I wrapped my hand around the bars though, I heard the unmistakable sound of a shotgun cocking. I had fired enough of them to know what that sounded like. I looked up, and by the meager red light of my taillights, I noticed someone standing not too far away. The red light made them look extremely intimidating, and they were definitely holding a gun. I watched them lower the gun and point it right at me. A lot of people instantly freeze when a gun is pointed at them. I didn't though. I let go of the gate and ran back to the car. No sooner than I'd slammed the door closed did I hear a shotgun blast ring out. Miraculously, it didn't hit me though. I took off as fast as I could down the narrow and dark road. The ride back home was terrifying, even scarier than it had been on the way there. I didn't calm down till I was back on the paved road and headed back to my own home. I told my dad what happened honestly. He was more upset it took me so long to get him his beer though. This was about 4.5 years ago, and I was 19 at the time. I was driving back home from the gym one night at around 1 a.m. or so. It was decently foggy outside. I passed by a crosswalk for our local trail called the Iron Horse Trail that has sensors that light up if someone is going to cross. They went off right as I passed by it. I looked back in my rear-view mirror and could see there was a person standing right there in the middle of the crosswalk. He was not even 10 feet behind the car. I had no idea how I could have possibly missed him, but it was certainly an ominous sight, so I punched it away. As I got to a stop sign about 100 yards away, I took a deep breath and looked behind me again. The same person appeared to be following me, now at a sidewalk stoplight not even 15 feet behind me somehow. I floored it again and freaked out. I drove and drove for quite a while. I was way past the turn for my house now. I was at least 5 turns away. I stopped at the next stop sign to backtrack and turned around to go back towards my house. I lost my breath though midway because in the middle of a turn, I saw what I thought to be that same person standing right in the middle of an unlit street with his back turned towards me. I felt thousands of shivers go down my spine. I held the gas down and blew right past him, or what I thought was the same man at least. I kept going down this long stretch. Eventually, I stopped to catch my breath though. I didn't even have a second before something landed on my roof with a metallic clang and the car started to violently shake. I hit the gas and saw a person roll off my roof and bounce off my bumper. I drove and drove for half an hour and hurried on my way home to calm down. I finally fell asleep in my bed. I was still living with my parents. I woke up the next morning to my mom saying, "Matt, were you racing around last night? I heard your car from a few blocks away. And why does the roof look like something fell on it?" I was groggy but got up, thinking it had just been a bad dream. I went into the garage with her and looked at the roof. It had marks on it like something had clearly landed there. Light dings and small dents, as if it had been struck by hail. I looked at my rear window and saw a very clear handprint on it and a boot scuff on my rear bumper. I lost any and all words I had. I didn't tell a single soul what happened that night. I still get shivers just thinking about it. I couldn't even drive that way for an entire week after. Hello, my name is Ninon, and I'm French. My story takes place in a small countryside in the south, a place where nothing usually happens. As I tell you this story, I must note it's now been 2 years since it happened, and I was 13 years old at the time. One evening, my parents decided to go have dinner at a friend's house, but I preferred to stay home. It was a Friday night, and I was dead tired. It was actually quite common for my parents to leave me alone at home in the evening, because I rarely went with them when they went out to eat or go to parties. I was used to being alone at night. I must admit that I often had this feeling of being watched when I was home alone, whether it was day or night, but I always thought it was just paranoia, at least until that night. So we're at the infamous night when my parents went to dinner at their friend's house, leaving me alone. I was watching TV on the couch with my cat when I decided to go back to my room to play on my phone a bit. After several minutes, though, I began to hear noises coming from the kitchen. It was actually quite a common thing because of the age of the house with it settling in, so I chalked it up to being fatigue and stress making me overthink things. A little while later, though, I heard what sounded distinctly like a glass being placed down on the dining table. The stress became more and more intense, and I did the dumbest thing I could do in that moment. I went to go see what was going on, only to find there was indeed a glass that hadn't been there before, placed on the dining table. It couldn't have been from me either. My stress rose even more. At the same time, though, I was in denial and told myself I must have left it there while clearing it. As I was about to return to my room, though, I heard something scratching behind the garage door. I was about to open it, thinking it must be my cat wanting to come in, but then I froze as I reached for the handle. I remembered our only cat had been on the couch with me earlier. I turned my head to check if he was still there, and unfortunately he was. So was my dog as well. At that moment, I was genuinely worried. I rushed back to my room, only to notice on the way back that my parents' bedroom window and the bathroom window as well were wide open. At that point, I didn't know what to do. I locked myself in my room with my cat and dog and scrolled through my phone trying to forget anything had happened. When my parents finally came back, I acted as if nothing had happened as well. I don't really know why I did this. I guess I was so scared I wasn't thinking properly. But currently, no one else knows about this story. It was near Halloween time when my friends and I were telling ghost stories. My friend said she was going to tell a story about her parents' first date. She said she didn't like telling this story since it was actually true, but we pressured her to do so. To cut to the chase, the parents had spent a nice first date, and around the time they would have said goodnight, the male in the situation, my friend's dad, suggested that instead they go for a midnight hike of Provo Canyon. He apparently knew the place quite well, since he had done a fair amount of rock climbing in the area. The two drove up to the mouth of the canyon, got out of their cars, and started hiking under just the light of the stars, since it was a new moon. At some point, the male started getting a bad feeling. since the pathway ahead, which would pass under some trees, would be dark, and because it was getting to be quite late. He ignored that feeling though, and pressed on. In later retellings of the story, the woman would say she had felt that same feeling at what was probably the same time, though she didn't know the trail like he did. A minute later, the feeling came back to the man. He ignored it again and started walking a bit of the way into the trees. And that was when his foot hit something soft in the middle of the path. It was too dark to see what this soft thing was, and that feeling came back stronger than ever. Instead of trying to find out what his foot had bumped into, he and the woman both agreed to hightail it out of there. Years later, after having been married for some time, they were watching an interview with a serial killer named Ted Bundy. In response to a question asking him to describe the time he felt closest to being caught, he explained about the night he had lured a girl into Provo Canyon and had just killed her when he heard some people coming up the trail. He explained how he hid in the trees just in time, only to watch some guy walk right into the body, then for some reason just turn around and walk away. I'm in the United States Coast Guard and used to be stationed in Oregon, where I'm actually from. There's trials and tribulations that your average human being would break down at the thought of there. We once rescued the broken body of a 3-year-old little girl whose own mother had thrown her off a bridge because of her schizophrenia. I pulled out more waterlogged corpses out of the ocean than I care to admit. But someone has to do it. The city where I was stationed in is steeped in local legend, from ghostly figures standing on the massive bridge peering over the side, like they're debating on whether or not their ethereal body should take the plunge, and hitchhiking specters. There's a bunch of pretty standard town lore. However, I had my own brush with the final calls for help from someone beyond the grave. Back in 2013, when I first joined the Coast Guard, we got a mayday call from a sailing vessel that was making its way from San Diego to Seattle. This was in November, and the coast was a breeding ground for bad weather. Awful life choices too, especially for sailboats, which were notorious along the west coast. Like any good guardsmen, we loaded up our lifeboats and headed towards the now capsized vessel, a mere 10 nautical miles away from our bay. When we got there, unfortunately, there was nothing left, except for debris and a couple of coolers, a life ring and some rigging as well. That was the only thing left of the side of the boat. Because of the incoming hurricane, we had to turn around and head home. We'd send out helicopters and boats as soon as the storm passed. However, we knew the chances of survival for the people on board had dropped to nil, especially because the waters were no more than 48 degrees Fahrenheit. With heavy hearts, we turned around and headed back for the land. There's always that what-if question in your head that makes you wonder if you could have done anything more. At the end of the day, though, you never know. You can't go back in time to try. Later that evening, I'm sitting in our communication center, monitoring the Marine Band radios and talking with my boss and best friend. All of a sudden, a frantic voice comes over the radio, and to this day, even typing it out or thinking about it gives me the chills. "Help! Mayday! I don't know where I am!" The voice was so quiet, and it sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. It didn't help that the storm was probably interfering with the radio. I picked back up, asking the vessel what their position and nature of distress was. There was never any response. My boss came into the room and replayed the message now on our electronic charts. We could pull up the caller's position, and that's what he did. I watched his eyes grow wide with horror as he pointed at the chart. It was at the sailboat's last known position, before it had gone down to its rest on the bottom of the ocean floor. I can say with certainty that this must have been the man's final cry for mercy before the great Pacific swallowed him whole for the last time. We searched for the man for 72 hours. Lifeboats, helicopters, local police and fire departments, but we never found any sign of him. I've been in the service for 5 years, and that's still the scariest thing I ever had to deal with in my life. I used to date a girl in college who lived 3 hours away. We would trade weekends, one at her school, one at my school. One day, she got really upset because she had driven all the way down to see me, and I happened to be in an all-night study session. She had known about this and knew I couldn't be home to see her. She texted me she was going to go back to her place, and then I never heard anything from her ever again. After 3 days of texting her repeatedly trying to make sure she was okay, the text started coming back as number not found. I sent her the stuff she'd left at my apartment in the mail, and that also was returned as no forwarding address. Her instant messenger account, which I never used but knew the name of, was now disconnected. It started to get even weirder. In a panic, I called her apartment landline and was told the people who had lived there had moved out. She had 3 roommates, and they hadn't left a number or any indication as to where they'd gone. I got really freaked out, needless to say. I asked friends who worked in school admin to pull some strings for me and make sure she was at least alive. When they checked, though, the school she was at did not have any records of her as a student. The license plate to her car was not registered to anyone either. None of our mutual friends ever saw her again. I called the police, but there were no car accidents involving anyone who fit her description on the stretch of road between our 2 schools. Not that night, nor in the 2 weeks after. I didn't ask for a longer time frame because at that point she had already been missing. The cops wouldn't file a missing persons report though, because I wasn't a family member. I have no idea what actually happened to her, why she freaked out on me so bad, or even if she's still alive. Maybe she's in a witness protection program or something. She just literally disappeared without a trace. So this happened a long time ago, but I've never forgotten it, as it was one of the strangest encounters my family and I have ever had. One time as a child, I went with my family to the grocery store. It was our monthly trip to stock up on groceries, so we were going to be there for quite a while. I was about 12 at the time, so by that age I had a good understanding of how to read people. We started in the produce aisle, when suddenly a strange man caught my eye. He was standing awkwardly close to us, sort of fake browsing through everything. His body language seemed off as well. He was standing with his back to us, but something was weird about the way he was positioned. As we moved down the aisle, he would always rotate so his back was facing us. As we got a little closer, I could tell he was wearing those see-behind glasses. Those gimmick sunglasses that have hidden mirrors on the inside of the lenses so you can see behind yourself? Yeah, that sort of thing. He had a dirty gray zip-up jacket on, and long messy hair as well. Had to be in his 40s at least. As our shopping went on, wherever we went, I would see him standing there, staring at me from across the store. He would keep his distance from us always, but still be within eyesight no matter where we were. About 30 minutes in, my mom still hadn't noticed, but he was really starting to bother me. Unfortunately, my mom didn't believe me at first. Eventually, we got to the refrigerator aisles, and that's when it got really weird. Whatever aisle we were in, he would quickly pace past us occasionally. At that point, he wasn't even trying to look like he was shopping. It was so obvious that my mom and sis were also starting to notice as well, and get quite concerned. At one point, we were grabbing something off one of the shelves, and I could see him just standing on the opposite aisle, peeking in between them at us. His sunglasses were on still, but now he had his hood up all the way. We started to walk faster and do random zigzags around the store to see if he really was following us. At least we could try to lose him. He would always keep up though, all in a very sneaky way at that. He would always just appear at the opposite end of the aisle, keeping up with us the whole time. At this point, we pushed up to the customer service area to talk to a manager about it, and at that point the man completely disappeared. We informed the manager and she was very helpful. She actually went to go try and find the guy and talk to him. We waited at the counter until she paced back to us with a confused look on her face. She walked up to my mother and told us, "He said you're his mom." At this point, my mom and sister were quite concerned and confused. The manager rang us up herself and said we should leave, and they would escort the strange man away. We walked out to the car, staying close to our mother, when we were met with a horrible sight. The man was just standing across the parking lot from our car, with his head tilted and a big grin on his face. We floored it out of there, but we could still see him standing there, watching us leave the whole time. What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in the comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.